Today we are in Romans chapter 13. Last week we were in Romans 12, and of course 13 follows 12. That's a good place to go. But we were talking about the mercies of God. Romans 12:1 says, in view of God's mercies, in view of how he has treated you not as you deserve, but he's treated you with love, and he sent his son to die for you. In view of that mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. That's how you worship God. Man, we had some good worship this morning, didn't we? That was really good. How was your worship before you showed up here? How was your worship last week? How was your worship while you were driving? And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, really wanted to show us that, hey, how we act during the week, that's actually worshiping God all week long. And so we talked about showing kindness to one another and giving mercy instead of giving what people we think they deserve. How did you do this week? Did you have somebody you needed to treat differently? They owed you forgiveness, but you forgave them anyway. You treated them kindly when they treated you. You brought your spouse maybe some food when she was angry at you, or your husband was angry. You brought him some food, or a drink, you know? Yeah. So that's what we've been learning. Paul has been talking about throughout Romans. Man, God loves you Jews that are sinners. He loves you. You Gentiles that are sinners that didn't have the law, God loves you. All of you are sinners. You guys all needed a Savior. And God responds by sending Jesus so that people could have a way to get to heaven. So we're moving from last week on how we treat one another, individuals, showing them mercy. Now we're going to move into how do we respond to government? How we respond to those in authority over us. And you think it's different than chapter 12? It's not going to be any different. Okay, but we're going to talk about it. Paul felt it was very important to move from the church to outside of the church. And this phrase kept going through my head. I didn't have it written down for this sermon, but before I got it to preach first service, and it was, our actions speak so loud sometimes, people can't hear what we say. I was like, man, who said that? So I looked it up in between services, and it's Ralph Waldo Emerson that said that. But I think that's very true. Our actions sometimes speak so loud, people can't hear us talk about Jesus. And so Paul is going to move from how we treat one another, giving mercy to one another, and he's going to say, how are we going to respond to those in authority over us? Look at verse 1 of chapter 13. It says this. It says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. In other words, God has put all people in authority, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That's hard to wrestle with. You think about all authority has been allowed to be an authority by God. And I think it will help us understand Paul's intent here, his heart behind this, when we learn about who was in authority over Paul when he wrote this. He wrote this about 58 AD, and the person in charge of the Roman Empire was a guy named Nero, okay? And Nero, was this a nice guy? Was it a good Christian guy, right? Full of Judeo-Christian beliefs, right? No. And so I want to put up a picture. I put up a picture. It's this senior portrait of Nero. Just so happened to have it. That's a joke. That's kidding. And here are the first 5 emperors of Rome, okay? And he was the 5th one. Paul is writing this during the time of Nero. Nero became emperor in 54 AD and reigned until AD 68. Nero was the 5th emperor of Rome. Nero was known as one of Rome's most infamous rulers. That's not more than famous. Infamous means he wasn't liked. He was not good. Nero was not good. He was notorious for his cruelty and his debauchery. Debauchery is excessive sexual immorality. He ascended to power in AD 54. At age 16, he became ruler of the Roman Empire. Wow. 16-year-old in charge of the Roman Empire. That's interesting. He died at age 30. He ruled at a time of great social and political change. He allegedly killed his mother and 2 of his wives. And he only cared about art, and he had very little interest in ruling the empire. This is the one in charge of the Roman Empire, of which Paul says, all authority has been instituted by God. And he's going to tell these Christians in Rome how to respond to a guy like this that's an authority over them. Now, if you think about our rulers here in America, of course, we've got, the president, and we've got governors and mayors and all that. So you could put our last 5 or 6 presidents, maybe next to that. Maybe we can do some comparison of how bad our presidents are compared to how bad the emperors were. You want to do that? So we got George Bush. I'll start with him, and then we got Bill Clinton. Then we got George W. Bush, and then we got Obama, and then we got Trump, and then we got Biden. All right? Just lay those out next to these emperors. And let's do a little comparing. We're not really going to go through that. That's not ours. We're not. But I want you to think about it in light of what we're going to be talking about in chapter 13. And think about the things that you don't like about certain presidents, or certain leaders, or certain governors, or certain mayors, or certain House of Representatives, certain senators, or certain, whatever it is. Think of it in light of Paul writing Romans 13 and saying what he says and having these people as those in authority over you. And I just wonder what Paul would think of us sometimes. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 again, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, so here's your first point, and this is what I narrowed this down to. No authority gets into office without God's allowance. And I'm telling you, my mind, when we look at this during Sermon Club Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock, my mind goes to a lot worse people than the emperors that I showed you, and a lot worse people than our last 5, 6 presidents. It went to people like Hitler. It went to people like, you fill in the blank. I want you to know that I took an honest look at that, and I had an honest thoughts about this passage when it came to all authority gets into office, and they only get into office with God's allowance. Man, that's hard to swallow. Throughout the Bible, though, God uses ungodly people in positions of authority to accomplish His will. And often it's encouraging His people to be humbled into seeing that you push God out and you don't want to live with God, there are consequences to that. And His heart behind any type of discipline from God is for us to turn our hearts back to God, to admit that His way is best. And man, sometimes He will do anything to get our attention. And I'm telling you, if you've had a son or a daughter go astray, and you see how much they live in ways that hurt them and hurt everybody around them, your heart breaks. And you want to do anything to turn them around. But I don't understand. God's ways are not my ways. My ways are not God's ways. But it seems here in Romans 13, Paul is saying, listen, all authority, God has allowed it to be in place. Look at verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities, resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what's good, and you'll receive His approval. And for He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for He does not bear the sword in vain. For He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. An avenger of God's wrath. People in authority. Who would Paul be thinking about? He had to be thinking about Nero. Wrote this about 58 AD. Nero has been the emperor for 2 years. Now understand that I believe that he was writing when Nero was more of an emperor of peace. He was more peaceful at that time. He didn't really get persecution against the church until about 64 AD. But really, all authority? Don't resist them? Yeah, I'm not sure that makes sense in light of other biblical stories. Can you think of stories in the Bible where people are like, I'm not going to obey the authorities that are put into place? Can you think of some? I can think of several. Name one. Throw it out. Daniel. First service, that was the first one somebody said. Daniel. Hey, a decree went out. Don't pray to anybody. Don't pray to anybody else. Don't pray to the Hebrew God. You pray to Nebuchadnezzar. You pray. And what did Daniel do? He prayed anyway. He defied the law, and he was thrown in the lion's den. How about his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? All right? They're like, hey, we're going to have this big old idol, 90 feet tall. When the music sounds, you bow to it. That is the law. That's a written law. If you don't do that, you're in big trouble. And those three guys, when the music sounded, they just stood there, not obeying the authorities. And they were thrown in the fiery furnace. I can think of the Egyptians, not the Egyptians, the Israelites went in their Egyptian bondage underneath Pharaoh, yeah? And the midwives were told, hey, when the Hebrew ladies have babies, and if they're male, you kill that baby. And the Hebrew midwives were like, this was their excuse. Well, the Hebrew moms that are giving birth, man, they're vigorous. Like they have the baby before we even get there. And we just can't do it. And they were lying. They were like, we can't defy God. We can't kill these male babies. We're not going to. And they defied the authority of the land. I can think of in Acts where Peter was preaching about Jesus and telling people, hey, man, you're the one that put Jesus on the cross. You guys need to repent of your sins. And people are like, hey, quit pinning this whole Jesus on the cross thing on us. Quit preaching about that. They threw him in jail. They get out of jail. God lets them out of jail. They go right back in the center square, and they start preaching again. And they get in trouble again, and they say to the authorities, we must obey God rather than men. We cannot stop teaching about Jesus. So when I see Romans chapter 13, verse 2, and this whole, don't resist these people in authority, they've been put there by God, it doesn't quite make sense in some of these areas. So in light of that, in other areas of the Bible where they seem to defy authority, and why did they do that? I wrote it this way. Authorities are to be obeyed unless they direct to sin against God. Unless they direct you to sin against God, then don't. Then don't. Now we got to define what is sinning against God and what they tell us to do. And I know in recent years that's been a seemingly gray area with that. But the point that Paul is making is that our behavior, when it comes to last week, people around us and how we treat them, this week, and how we react to those governing over us, it either points people to Jesus or it points them away from Jesus. Our actions either point people away from Jesus or it points people closer to Jesus. And Paul he's so concerned that we represent God in a good, holy way because he wants all people to be saved. That he is going to say, these people that are in authority over you, listen, be so careful on how you respond to them. They need Jesus too. And Paul is like, if we can get their attention by how we behave in a holy and pure way, perhaps it will change our government, perhaps it'll change our world. How do you respond to those that are around you that you don't agree with? And this includes the government. It includes those in authority over us. And we can learn a lot from Paul, who wrote this, because Paul writes it in about 58 AD. In 64 AD, you have the burning of Rome. You have 10 out of 14 districts of Rome on fire. And Nero, the emperor, decides to blame the Christians. And who are the Christians he's blaming? People like Paul. Followers of Jesus. People like Peter, Apostle Peter. And we're going to look at how much Paul believed his words in Man, how I behave is going to influence people in authority, because Paul himself is beheaded in about 64 AD under the authority of Nero, the Roman emperor. So listen, I'm telling you, when he writes these words, like, he's serious. He's serious in how we respond to those in authority over us. Peter, another apostle, at this same time in 62 and 63 AD. Remember, Rome catches on fire in 64 AD. So the previous 2 years, at some point, Peter writes these words. He says, verse 13 of 1 Peter 2, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to the governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, but don't use your freedom as a cover-up for doing evil. Live as servants of God." Peter, he's writing this in 62 or 63 AD under the Emperor Nero, who is going to inflict horrible things on the Christians. Once 64 AD happens, he says, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor." And Peter, within a year or two, he's killed for his faith. He's crucified by Nero. And he says, you know what? He begged to be not crucified like Jesus because he didn't feel like that would be a disgrace for him to be crucified like Jesus. He didn't feel worthy enough to be crucified right side up. So he begged them, "Crucify me upside down." And that's how much Peter believed that, man, it is so important that people know about Jesus. Think of the things that they could have complained about with the Roman authorities. Think of the things that we complain about. I mean, even on a local level. Okay, let me throw out a couple, okay? Too many pizza places in Star, all right? Who's letting them build these pizza places? Like, it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective when it comes to complaining about things. These roads are not sustainable for increased traffic. I don't even like the certain speed limits they put in this town. Do you know that on such and such a road, they got a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit? Okay, I'm speaking at that. I really believe this. I hate that speed limit. I don't like it, why are some buildings and subdivisions and businesses allowed to be built and others not, and blah, 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 blah. And then Paul, what would Paul or Peter think of the things that we complain about when it comes to our governing authorities? There's a 71-year-old man who was arrested in Tokyo for making 24,000 complaint phone calls to his phone operator, police said. Okitoshi Akamoto is accused of making thousands of calls to KDDI's free number in just 8 days. He made thousands of calls, accusing them of violating his contract. The company told media he had been calling repeatedly for a total of 2.5 years. Let it go, man. Mr. Okamoto, here's the funny thing. Mr. Okamoto denies harassing the firm and told the police he was the victim in the situation. Worse yet, he was a member of the Tokyo Christian Church located, I'm just kidding. The article did not say that. The article did not say that. But what would it say? What would it say if they found out he was a member of a certain church? And it's just so like, Paul is so concerned that how we act towards those that are in governance over us has a reflection on Jesus. Like whether we like it or not, I don't like it, but whether I like it or not, people look at us and they're like, that's Jesus. That's who represents Jesus. If they are that way, and Christians are that way, then Jesus is that way. And God's that way. And I don't like it. It's not fair. But Paul is like, he understands how people think. And so he's wanting us to live in such pure and holy lives that when they see us, they see the God that loves them. Philippians 2:14 says, do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. Do everything without complaining or arguing? Really? Have you been around my neighborhood? I took my dog for a walk, I think it was Friday, and I'm walking around the subdivision, and of course, I got my dog on a leash because that's what you're supposed to do, right? Or maybe you don't have to, but I think I'm supposed to. I know I'm supposed to. And I'm walking, and then the dog likes just smelling, and so you got to let the dog smell. That's how they're looking around. That's how they're releasing anxiety. Let's talk about our dogs. Okay. And she's sniffing some other dog's poop. And I'm like, get out, and I walk away, and I start walking my dog, another quarter of the way around our subdivision, and she found another pile of poop. Now I'm getting mad. Why won't people pick up their dog's poop? Anybody? I get another fourth of the way around, and I find another pile, and it looks like the previous two piles. Why won't people pick up their poop? So you get home, and you get your Facebook out, and you pop it up, and you get your HOA and your subdivision. You're like, boop, 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 boop. Or, see, my wife wasn't with me when I took my dog for the walk. I did not get on social media, by the way. But a couple days prior, my wife and I were walking our dog, and I don't know if it was this time, but sometimes I'm like, honey, hey, our dog hasn't pooped yet. And she goes, well, somebody didn't clean it up. She's cleaning up somebody else's dog's poop. See, it doesn't mean you don't say something to your HOA or you say something to other people, but the way in which you do it, the way in which that you share truth with people, it'll either push them away from the Lord or it'll move them more towards the Lord. And speaking the truth in love will move them more towards the Lord. That just the way we respond to our governing authorities, and our governing authorities can be many, many different things, can't they? How we respond. Do everything without grumbling or complaining so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God. Shining bright. And when you do that, people are like, something's different. These Christians aren't all about complaining. These Christians have hope. There's hope for the world. And it must be this Jesus in them that's different. We are representatives of God in the world. And when they see us, they need to see Christ and get a good picture of who God is. So Paul in the previous chapter, in chapter 12, remember he started chapter 12 with, and you can look back at it if you want, I appeal to you, I'm begging of you. Get along with one another. And I think Paul is continuing this same urgency that people need to know Jesus. And then he goes from how we treat one another to look at the government. And in their day and age, they had probably Roman soldiers all over the place representing who was in authority over them, and he was teaching them, here's how you live differently. And he gets very practical in verse 6. He says, for because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. And you could respond with, well, I don't owe them nothing. Paul's not saying that. He's saying they've been put in authority over you, that you are to pay taxes. And I think the Christians reading this, they're reading this letter from Paul, they would have thought of many different types of authorities just as we would think of different types of authorities. They would probably think of the authorities down at the synagogue. If this was read maybe in Jerusalem, he passed these letters around, their authorities, they'd think, well, maybe the priests down at the temple. Oh, those are crooked people. I would never pay the temple tax. Those are crooked people. No, he's saying, give what is owed. And then in regards to their emperor and all the different taxes that would be unfair in their day and age, it's the same here as well. And here's the point. Give what is owed regardless of who is in authority. Man was on vacation. I'm going to take John Crist is a comedian. I'm going to take his approach. He says, when you share truth with people, be sure to make them laugh. Otherwise, they will kill you. I like that quote. A man was on vacation strolling around outside his hotel in Acapulco, enjoying the sunny Mexican weather, and suddenly this woman near him attracted his attention because she's screaming and yelling, and she's looking at her child. She's kneeling in front of her child, and the man knew enough Spanish to know that the kid was choking on something, and he had swallowed a coin. And so he grabbed the kid by the heels, and he hung him up like this and shook him, took him upside down and shook him until an American quarter fell out. She's like, thank you so much. You knew what you were doing. You must be a doctor. He says, no, I'm with the United States Internal Revenue Service. So I think we have our jokes about taxes here. But they did too. Back then, they had some things about people that collected taxes. The Babylonian Talmud, it's a compilation of rabbinic opinion on the laws of Moses. They wrote all these opinions down. It placed tax collectors alongside murderers and robbers, the IRS people. That's how they viewed them. The rabbis taught that tax collectors were disqualified witnesses in court. They were societal outcasts and utter disgraces to their own families. The rabbis excommunicated tax collectors from the synagogue. They weren't allowed to go into the synagogue. Tax collectors weren't allowed to exchange money at the temple. And the rabbis even considered it lawful to lie almost any conceivable way to avoid paying tax collectors. This is where Jesus came in to these groups of people, and he preaches to them, and he shares with them. And this is who Paul learned from. About how we should treat one another. And Jesus, wasn't the guy named Levi, but he's also known as Matthew, the tax collector? And Jesus called him to be a follower of his. Didn't Jesus say to Zacchaeus, hey, I'm going to your house today? And how did Jesus treat corrupt people in authority? Man, he so wanted them to know that there's a God that loved them and that was going to send Jesus to die for them. And Paul is like, hey, man, how we behave, it's either going to point people to Jesus or away from Jesus. So give what's owed regardless of who's in authority. In Mark chapter 12, they came to Jesus and said, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? And the Herodians were with them, and they were trying to trap Jesus. You ever felt like religious people try to trap you with their questions? It still happens today. He says, but knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarii, and let me look at it. And they brought one, and he said to them, whose likeness and inscription's on this? Caesar's. And Jesus said, well, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Oh, wait, Jesus, I got some more questions. And I can see him just going, you're not putting me in that spot. And walks away. Another time in Matthew chapter 17, verse 24, it says, when they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax, which I believe was the tax for the temple, went up to Peter and said, notice they didn't approach Jesus. They went up to one of the other apostles. Hey, by the way, does your teacher pay the tax, the 2 drachma tax? He said, well, yes, he does. And then he came into the house. Jesus spoke to him first saying, well, hey, Simon, what do you think? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or others? And Jesus is going to make a point that Jesus is the creator of all things. All things belong to him. It should be all the people giving to Jesus, not Jesus giving to anything. And Peter is one of his followers. And Peter is like, you're a follower of me. You're with me. Like, you wouldn't even pay tax either. But it goes on to say, and when he said from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. We don't need to give tax. However, not to give offense to them, he go to the sea and cast a hook and take to the first fish that comes up. And he paid it to not give offense. Even the creator of the universe subjected himself to those in authority on earth. Give what is owed, regardless of who's in authority. And listen, man, as an American citizen, there's a lot of things you can do to try to change laws. You can run for an office. You can do so much more than they could back there. But Paul is so concerned about our light. Our light. And he ends this section with a whole section of how to live. Verse 8, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Sometimes our anger towards those in authority is just to get the eyes off of us and all the stuff that we still have to submit to the Lord. It just gets the eyes off of us. Paul ends, and you can read the rest of it. He says, walk properly in the daytime, not in orgies of drunkenness. But here's the last point. Be a light in a dark world. Be a light in a dark world. And listen to this. It's more important that we have the right behavior than for the politicians to have the right policies. This is, man, by our actions, they're so loud that people can't hear what we say about Jesus. It is more important that we have good, godly behavior than for all these politicians to have the right policies. People knew if the church acted differently, it would draw people to Jesus. And so here's the takeaway. How will my actions point people to the saving work of Jesus Christ? How will my action... Well, you may be so right, and like that is morally wrong. And the way you treat people, people see that more than they hear the truth of Jesus. So it's kind of, Paul is just kind of saying, okay, now reflect on how you're acting. You know that you're a sinner. God showed you mercy. He didn't give you what you do deserve. He's given you grace. Now, how are you going to live that out? You're going to live it out in a way that you're a light to those that are around you, and you point them to Jesus. So, can we be careful on how we respond to those that we don't agree with, both in the church and those outside the church? Can we be careful about that? It's more important that they know about Jesus, because when you change the heart, then the actions change. Policies change when the heart is right. And if there's ever a time our politicians and people in authority need Jesus, it's now. So let's point them to Jesus.